Good morning, AP Lit students. This is just your short kind of explanation lecture over the third reading assignment for Frankenstein, which is chapter 4, 5, 6, and 7. These chapters get us further into the story, and we finally have the point which, we are all most familiar with regarding the story of Frankenstein, which is obviously that he has this monster that he brings to life. So, a couple things that I wanted to say just to kind of frame out um, what we're looking at closely here, rather than just okay, I'm reading for plot. Is in these chapters, the main focus is the characterization of Victor Frankenstein. So I've been finishing grading a lot of your guys' essays, and in this new focus on the AP test for this year, where the question is only going to be about question 2, which is given a piece of prose, analyze it, and respond to the prompt. A majority of the time, question 2 will ask you in some way, shape, or form to explain the complex characterization of some character that's in the passage. So these chapters then become really important because if I were to ask you something, like I did in the opening letters, characterize Robert Walton, if I were to say choose, 300 word passage that you think helps to explain the complex characterization of Victor Frankenstein, these would be a really good set of chapters to do that with because we find out more about him rather than just his upbringing, which is what the first 3 chapters gave us. In the first 3 chapters, we find out about how his parents met and we establish a lot of the motifs, and we find out that he's a curious boy who's been given this gift of this sibling, quote unquote, Elizabeth, and he's different than his friend Henry, in that Henry is more of a romantic soul and Victor is more of a rational scientific soul. So now we actually see what kind of person he is, because if you remember when we left off, as far as where we are in our map is where we are in the world, Victor is 17 and he goes off to school to study at university in Ingolstadt. Okay, which is in Germany. So he is now away from Switzerland, away from Geneva and his family. He had some encounters with these 2 separate professors, one who is kind of this like, makes fun of him and mocks him, yet still is in charge of a course of study that he likes, and then one that he really looks to as a mentor. So we've got Mr. Kremp and Mr. Waldman. So in the beginning of chapter 4, and oh, my fun little memes, I've got a couple for this section. This is something that I want you to consider in your characterization of Victor Frankenstein. So by now you've figured out that Frankenstein is the man, Victor. The monster is going to be unnamed. So this is one of the common misconceptions. However, I love the sentiment that comes from this. Knowledge is knowing that Frankenstein isn't the monster, meaning the name Frankenstein isn't given to the monster, but wisdom is understanding that he is. So note that the changes that he's going to go through. He's not a bad guy right now, but we're going to see some changes happen to him. And again, mirroring back to Rime of the Ancient Mariner, it's kind of like what we saw with the Old Mariner, right? He's not a bad guy, but he does this bad thing, and then it's kind of his reaction to that that starts to define who he is. So in chapter 4, we begin with basically establishing the fact that Victor has this obsession with science. The first sentence of chapter 4, in fact, is from this day, natural philosophy, particularly chemistry in the most comprehensive sense of the term, became nearly my sole occupation. So, in other words, this is what he comes to live for while at university. He talks about the influences of these 2 men on him, but there's a lot more that is kind of honed in on the fact that he is, putting all of himself into the study of science, right? And the question becomes why? What's the motivation there? Is it just that you really, really like it? And that's not necessarily the case. Towards the middle of the first page of chapter 4 in my copy on page 31, it says, the stars often disappeared in the light of the morning while I was yet engaged in my laboratory. So he spends literally all of his time there. Further down the page, he says, 2 years passed in this manner, during which I paid no visit to Geneva, but was engaged heart and soul in the pursuit of some discoveries which I hoped to make. So now we kind of start to understand his motivation. He's trying to make a name for himself. He's trying to discover something or do something really great. And in fact, that's the reason that he has thrown himself wholly into this pursuit of science. So another thing that I would ask you to kind of consider here is not just what he's doing, but what he is not doing in terms of, developing his character. He doesn't go home for 2 years. And in fact, the when he left home initially, remember his mom just died. Elizabeth then has to become the one that takes care of the household, including his father, his younger brother. So not only does he not go home to see anybody just in the normal, day-to-day life, but he doesn't go home to see anybody after this terrible tragedy that's happened. He lost his mother, and now he's figuratively losing his family as well. So we see that he is literally sacrificing everything in order to pursue greatness, right? So on the next page of chapter 4, as he continues talking about science and how he passes his day, you might think like, oh, it's a lot of painstaking detail, but this is all part of the characterization, and it's also developing the different Gothic and Romantic themes that we see here. If this will show up on the page. Yeah, elements of the Gothic and Romantic. I would ask you to start noting some of these passages where we really see and we can identify the fact that this is a Gothic novel. On page 32, which is the second page of chapter 4, he talks about how he really becomes interested in physiology, and he starts to examine the causes of life, and he wants to observe the natural decay. So he starts literally hanging out in morgues, and they refer to them here as charnel houses, because he wants to see how the body decomposes. So there's this kind of gross passage about 2/3 of the way down the page where he says, "My attention was fixed on every object the most insupportable to the delicacy of human feelings. I saw how the fine form of man was degraded and wasted. I beheld the corruption of death succeeded to the blooming cheek of life. I saw how the worm inherited the wonders of the eye and brain." So literally, he's watching these maggots move through this dead body into the cavity of the skull where the brain and the eyes would have been. So, yeah, you would say that he's kind of a creepy guy if this is what he is obsessed with and spending all of his time doing. However, it's through these different kind of recognition and looking at these different bodies and forms of decay that he realizes what he wants to do. It says, "I succeeded in discovering the cause and generation of life." So, in other words, he realizes that he wants to, since he knows how to reanimate life, he wants to be able to bring people back, to reanimate, to almost reverse or nullify the decay that bodies go through. Now, another interesting thing that this kind of helps us to characterize is a guy that spends all of his time in morgues looking at dead bodies and kind of going through, these corpses that might be in coffins or, be in graves. These are people who, were buried, and there was, they had attachments in the world. They had people that cared about them. So his absolute disregard for the fact that he's observing someone that was once alive, that was a person with a soul, it kind of shows ironically that he doesn't have really a regard for human life. As much as he wants to reanimate, it's not necessarily to bring back someone that he cares about, but it's more because he feels like this is the ultimate discovery that he can make. So we have a couple breaks in the frame story throughout the rest of this chapter, where Victor Frankenstein, breaks back to being in the Antarctic talking to Robert Walton, remember, who he's kind of, saying, trying to teach a lesson to. So one example is on page 33. He says, "I see by your eagerness and wonder and hope with which your eyes express, my friend, that you expect to be informed of the secret of which I am acquainted. That cannot be. Listen patiently until the end of my story, and you will easily perceive why I am reserved upon that subject." So remember, the whole point of saying this isn't to brag about what he wants to do or what he accomplished, but instead it's to caution Robert Walton in his own vaulting ambitions. Um, on the bottom of page 33, he starts to form what exactly he wants to do as far as reanimation. In fact, on the last line on page 33, he says, as the minuteness of the parts formed a great hindrance to my speed, I resolved, contrary to my first intention, to make the being of a gigantic stature. That is to say, about 8 feet in height and large. So this monster is going to come to be obviously a real physical, tangible being, but it's also going to be the monster as a symbol. And so, if this is to be his ultimate, discovery or creation, there's something to be said in the fact that he wants to make this creation really, really big. We might say there's some overcompensating going here, right? Or, some people say like little man syndrome. So he's trying to make this thing huge. And that's part of, his wanting to have a big legacy here. Um, he goes on. We have some more Gothic passages, and especially when it gets down to how he starts to collect parts for this monster. In the middle of page 34, he says, "Who shall conceive the horrors of my secret toil as I dabbled among the hallowed damps of the grave, or tortured the living animal to animate the lifeless clay? I collected bones from charnel houses and disturbed with profane fingers the tremendous secrets of the human frame." So he's grave robbing, which is, not just repulsive, but it's also morally reprehensible, the fact that you're going through. And then throughout this whole time, we find that more and more time is passing. The summer months passed while I was thus engaged, heart and soul in one pursuit. It was a most beautiful season. So not only is he missing out on, the love and relationships of his family, but he's missing out on the beauties of nature throughout these seasons. And that's where we get some more of these romantic ideas. Romantics, people that value the imagination, they value the natural world and emotions and feelings. So he's missing out on all that. So a question is going to be, is the sacrifice worth it? Is the juice worth the squeeze? In other words. So we end the chapter with another break in the frame story, but then him also talking about how he was so obsessed with this, discovery that he wanted to make, that we have another repetition of the motif of sickness. He talks about how every night he was oppressed by a slow fever. That became nervous almost to a painful degree, but he believed that the fever was what was driving him, and so any sort of exercise or amusement he would have would drive away the incipient disease or would drive away the fever with which he had. So during this time, we also see his father writes to him and tries to, tell him that he wants to hear from him. Think of us with affection, and he totally disregards his father, which, not to get super symbolic again, but remember, the father is the creator. So we have a disregard for the love of a creator here. So his dad is trying to help him, trying to guide him, but he kind of eschews that and backs away from it. All right, and that takes us to the end of chapter 4. So just a couple notes to make sure things that we paid attention to. Note the sacrifices that Victor makes in order to pursue his goals. This is going to be ironic, the things that he chooses to avoid here in order to create this creature. That's going to come back and be like, oh, really? His study of anatomy is ironic to his overall goal. And more than any other chapter so far, the content of chapter 4 exemplifies Gothic literature. A lot of the, dealing with human bodies and the worms and the maggots, all of that is kind of grotesque, and it's mentioned to get a certain reaction out of us, and also, his intensity and his passion and his emotions. So that's the end of chapter 4. All right, and we will move on now to chapter 5. Okay, so chapter 5 might seem a little bit anticlimactic once you actually figure out what happens right at the beginning, but essentially, chapter 5 is the result of all of his years of working to reanimate and create life. So, in the first paragraph of chapter 5, he basically says, "Hey, and on this really dark and stormy night in November, I made the monster come alive." Right? So the moment he says, with the anxiety of almost mounted agony, I collected the instruments of life around me that I might use to infuse a spark of being into the lifeless thing that lay at my feet. It was already 1 in the morning. The rain pattered dismally against the pane, and my candle was nearly burnt out, when by the glimmer of a half-extinguished light, I saw the dull yellow eye of the creature open. It breathed hard, and a convulsive motion agitated its limbs. So, um, one of the questions that I always begin this chapter with is, one of the ones you guys are really familiar with, which is what is the tone of this passage? And in chapter 4, we really start seeing, it's another Gothic kind of device, but a lot of imagery that deals with dark and light. So in this beginning chapter, it's 1 a.m, it's dreary night, meaning it's super dark outside, right? And the symbolism of the darkness. The only thing that he has with him is a candle that is nearly burnt out, so a lack of light. So kind of starting to see and notice how that symbolism is going to play out and contribute to the overall tone and meaning throughout this. So the monster is alive. So he completes exactly what he wanted to do. He his ambitions have come to fruition, and he has reanimated life. But throughout the next paragraphs, we see the description of the monster, and the first word that he says about this being, right, once it's alive, is he calls it a wretch. Beautiful, great God. So that's definitely sarcastic. His yellow skin scarcely covered the work of muscles and arteries beneath. His hair was of a lustrous black, of flowing, his teeth of a pearly whiteness, but these luxuriances only formed a more horrid contrast with his watery eyes that seemed almost the same color as the dun white sockets in which they were set, his shriveled complexion and straight black lips. So we're given this really repulsive kind of description of the monster. Now, here is where it's really important to remember that he is the creator and the monster is the creation. So, one of the essential questions that I kind of posed to you guys in the beginning is what kind of responsibility do creators have to their creation? So, you could think of that in terms of parents. What kind of responsibilities or things do we expect of parents in terms of, raising their children or teaching their children? And so Victor, where he, has this great upbringing, these caring people around him, his first thing that he does when he brings his monster to life is he runs, right? He finds the monster horrid, and so he leaves. He said, "For this had I deprived myself of rest and health." So it's almost like an oh crap moment. I can't believe I did that. Cue back to the symbolism of Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner. As soon as he does it, it's a oh crap moment, right? So he rushes out of the room. He goes to his bed. He literally hides in his bedchamber, right? So this would be a bed that has curtains around all the sides of it. And so to help you kind of, again, I'm a fan of the memes. So when Victor Frankenstein brings the monster he created to life, literally just leaves the room, right? And so that's his first reaction. So as far as a creator goes, he's being a pretty crappy creator here. He starts to have these really good dreams. So again, Mary Shelley was a romantic writer, so she's not one that's saying, "Yay, science! Science is good." So the only peace that he finds in these 2 years, once he leaves his obsession of science, he dreams of Elizabeth. He dreams of being back home in Geneva. Or sorry, he dreams of Elizabeth and kissing her on the streets of Ingolstadt. Soon, however, his dream turns into a nightmare, which is kind of some foreshadowing again. And she dies in his arms. When he opens his eyes, the creature is there. Now, yes, it would be super creepy if you had a bed that had a curtain around all sides of it and you woke up and there was a giant monster standing over you looking at you. But I think just to be fair to the monster, or the wretch as he's called here, note that the description, he's not being menacing in a way that he's looking at Frankenstein. On the top of page 37, it says, "I beheld the wretch, the miserable monster whom I had created. He held up the curtain of the bed, and his eyes, if they may be called that, were fixed on me. His jaws opened, and he muttered some inarticulate sounds, while a grin wrinkled his cheeks." So he's trying to smile, he's trying to speak, but he can't because he does not know how. He has not been taught by his creator. So it's almost as if, okay, we can say, I feel for Frankenstein here. This dude is super creepy, 8 feet tall, made of dead body parts. But at the same time, he's just looking for the only being that he has seen, the one who brought him to life. So how fair is Victor being to him here? All right, so again, Frankenstein runs away from him, runs out into the streets, and he's totally paranoid. And we have a direct allusion. There's a portion of Rime of the Ancient Mariner that's included in the text. Like one who on a lonely road doth walk in fear and dread, and having once turned round walks on, and turns no more his head, because he knows a frightful fiend doth close behind him tread. So when we read the poem, we talked about what's worse, facing your fear, turning around and acknowledging what is behind you, what is following you, or never turning around trying to escape it, but always knowing that it's going to be lurking close behind. So here we see Victor's not going to face his fear. He walks on until, by lucky happenstance, he runs into his friend Henry Clerval from back home in Geneva, his best friend, who fills him with joy at the sight of him. And Henry basically says that he's here to see him. He worked his magic. He's here to study. His dad is finally going to allow him to come up here and study some different things. And Frankenstein says, cool, well, yeah, all the things that have been keeping me really busy, I'm sorry I didn't write, but I seem to be free of that, referring to the monster in his studies. So he once more enters his chamber, doesn't see the monster there. So now the monster is gone. So he has, not only brought this thing into the world, but now has totally abandoned it. And whatever the monster kind of does, he has no part of. But it does say that Victor now, once everything catches up with him, he gets sick. He has a nervous fever. He has a sickness that causes him to basically black out and be an invalid for all of the fall and winter, the rest of the winter, right? So he created the monster in November. And as soon as he comes back to, after Henry takes care of him, remember, Henry is kind of a savior in this sense. He's a life giver. We end with that cheesy foreshadowing again, which is, oh, hey, if you happen to be feeling better, perhaps you might want to read this letter that your cousin, Elizabeth, his cousin, remember, has written to you. And that's where we end chapter 5. So the creation of the monster may be a little bit anticlimactic because it didn't go into a lot except for the fact that he's terrified of his monster, but some things to pay attention to for chapter 5. Like we said, the tone of the first paragraphs in this chapter, the motif, really important, of creator and creation. All right. The epigraph of this novel, and this is something I'm just going to bring up here, another creator creation, is from Paradise Lost. So the epigraph is that little quote at the beginning of the book again, where it says, we'll revisit it here real quick. Did I request thee, maker, from clay to mold me man? Did I solicit thee from darkness to promote me? So in that, we say, how is this epigraph effective at foreshadowing the monster's feelings? We're going to enter another part of the frame story. Because the monster at this point is gone, at some point we're going to catch up with him and we're going to hear the monster's side of the story for everything. And essentially, in that question here, Adam questioning, God, like, did I request thee to make me from clay? So in other words, I didn't ask to be made. So all of this stuff that I have to go through now, like, that's on you because you're the one that made me. All of the sins that I've done, if I've done anything, it's because of you. You're the one that created me. So that's foreshadowing some of maybe how the monster is going to feel based on Victor creating him. Victor's response when he sees Henry is the serene joy. This is going to be ironic because he is in fact not going to bring joy to his family and friends. And I just said, analyze the significance of his illness at the close of the chapter. Well, we know that illness is, again, a significant motif. So it's something to think about. When do people get ill, or what happens when they get ill in this book? What could that mean as far as the function? All right, and we will now go into chapter 6. All right, so when we get to chapter 6, which is a pretty breezy one to work through, we find that there's something significant that's happened as far as the shift in the tone. I think I've gone back a little too far. Here we go. So I just want to kind of bring your attention to this tone before we talk about it. Chapter 5 was heavy as far as it was, we could say, a low chapter as far as the tone. It was really dark and foreboding. It was filled with illness and, the reanimation of this monster and the introduction of this fear that's now going to follow Frankenstein around. So by contrast, chapter 6 kind of uplifts. The tone is a lot more positive. Victor reads a letter from his cousin Elizabeth, and she basically catches him up on how everything's going back home in Geneva. his father's really healthy. One of his brothers, Ernest, is 16, and he works really hard, and he's excited to join the foreign services. She talks about how beautiful their house is, the placid lake. Um, and then she gets into a lot of detail of this woman named Justine Moritz. So again, we have another female being introduced here, and she fits a lot of these other motifs or these archetypes that we're seeing. She's brought into the family by Victor's mother before she passed away. She was kind of rescued because her mother was a widow with four other children. So we've got, fatherless, again, part of this repetition, this motif that we're seeing. And so they take pity on Justine, and she comes to live with them, and she takes on the duties of, like a servant, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. In her letter, Elizabeth says, she learned the duties of a servant, a condition which in our fortunate country does not include the idea of ignorance and a sacrifice of the dignity of a human being. So servant, as far as like helps out with the chores, but not seen as like a lower being. Eventually, in her recounting Justine's history, she talks about how Justine's mom gets sick and calls her home. Justine herself gets very ill, and eventually Justine is allowed to return to living with the Frankenstein family. All of her other brothers and sisters dead. Her mother's health kind of is going up and down. So she is an orphan eventually and comes back to live with the family. And basically, Elizabeth brings this up to say, yeah, and I love her. So she's back now, and this is great. She's wonderful. We're going to notice as readers that it's going to have more to do with foreshadowing in the future. And then finally, she wraps it up with news of his youngest brother, William. William is, full of life. He's rosy with health. And then she shares the latest gossip. So all of these things are other parts that are going to lift up Victor's spirits, right? Even though he knows he's done this terrible thing in creating this monster, now he knows that his family is happy, everyone is well. As the chapter continues, he talks about how Henry starts to begin his studies at Ingolstadt. So he's introducing him around to his favorite professors. They spend a lot of time together walking out in nature. They talk about the change of the seasons. And overall, we can see that Victor's health starts to improve. So as far as when he was engrossed in the sciences, he was sickly and pale, and he was obsessed, and that was painted in a really negative light. And now that he's back, forming relationships with people, being outside, enjoying life, you know, hearing from his family, he's brought back to health. One thing you might note in this chapter is that after unleashing this 8-foot, wretch on the world, he's not looking for the monster at all. So it's kind of like out of sight, out of mind. So again, as far as being a creator, he's doing a really crappy job. But this is the chapter where our hopes and our spirits are kind of uplifted. So what I have just in our notes is Justine, William, Clairville School, touring Ingolstadt, all of these things help to rejuvenate him in a very romantic sense. These things are good in and of themselves, but they also have positive effects on Victor. Chapter 6, which just lifted our spirits, Chapter 7 is now going to crush them. So we're going to see some of these things catch up with Victor that he has, pleasantly or conveniently forgotten about. Which brings us to chapter 7. So sorry, I skipped over that. All right. All right, so chapter 7 is the chapter where Victor finally returns home. And this is unfortunately due to some pretty negative circumstances. So in the notes, I said chapter 6 lifts our spirit, chapter 7 crushes them. So essentially, we begin chapter 7 with a letter from Victor's father, who reveals the terrible news that his brother William is dead. He has been murdered, he was found strangled, and the dad quickly recounts a summary of what happened. A week ago, he was walking out with Victor's two brothers, Ernest and William. William is the younger of the two, along with Justine and Elizabeth. And at some point, they became separated. And when they came back during their walk and found him, or to look for him, he was lying motionless in the grass, and he had been strangled. They also discovered that the locket that he carried, where there was a picture of Victor's mother, Carolyn, the picture was gone, and the murderer had taken this as well. And so that's kind of what he leaves Victor with. So immediately, Victor and Henry, they leave university and they decide to go back to Geneva. On the way, Victor becomes ill. So again, we've got that motif of the illness returning. And they spend a few days out in nature and the romantic scenery again. And eventually they come up to the town of Geneva. So we have the motif and the symbol of darkness coming back again here. When they return to Geneva, it's really dark outside. And what they mean by this is it's the middle of the night. And small towns such as this one, especially like out in the mountains, they were gated, meaning that there was some kind of a wall that circled the entire place. And they come back so late that it's gated, and they're unable to get back into the city to go home. So they kind of have to just ride out this storm. So there's this terrible storm. The weather here is another symbol of Gothic literature. There's lightning, there's thunder. It keeps showing this beautiful scenery, but in kind of a menacing way. The lake, the mountains, the crags and peaks. And during one of these lightning flashes on page 50, Victor sees the monster. He says at the bottom of the page, "A flash of lightning illuminated the object and discovered its shape plainly to me. Its gigantic stature and the deformity of its aspect, more hideous than belongs to humanity, instantly informed me that it was the wretch, the filthy demon who I had given life. What did he there? Could he be, I shuddered at the conception, the murderer of my brother? No sooner did that idea cross my imagination than I became convinced of its truth." So he realizes in the instant that he sees this monster basically lurking around the outside gates of Geneva that he was the one that killed Victor's brother. But he doesn't pursue him, even knowing that he just killed, this is death number one. He killed Victor's brother. He doesn't go after him. He says, "Oh, he's too fast," because at the next lightning flash, I notice he's already in this, perpendicular area right at the base of the mountain. So for the first time on page 51, we see Victor take some responsibility. He says, "Alas, I had turned loose into the world a depraved wretch whose delight was in carnage and misery. Had he not murdered my brother?" So he does kind of take responsibility here, but yet, no, he still doesn't do anything about it. In fact, even later on, going home to see his family and find out about his murdered brother, he says he can't tell anybody about it because it would look like the ravings of insanity and the animal would elude all pursuit. So he says he can't tell anyone because nobody would believe him. So in the morning, the gates open up. He goes in. He finds his older brother, or not his older brother, but the older of his younger brothers, Ernest, who basically, lets him know, unfortunately, that Elizabeth, being a woman, she needs comforting because she's the most upset. But he also finds out that Justine Moritz, their servant that's been a part of their family since Victor was young, she's the one that's being accused. She's going to be put on trial. Because she's put on trial, she became ill, but the only evidence that they have against her is that when she went out, on their walk and fell asleep, when she woke up, the picture that had been stolen from the locket that little William carried was in her pocket. So if we go along with Victor's line of reasoning, the monster is the one that killed the little boy, then the monster also planted the picture on Justine, to make her look like the guilty party. So here we can see that the female, again, the female role is being developed, one that is weak and in need of saving. But then here also maybe someone is more of like a scapegoat or more of a sacrificial kind of role. And here is, admittedly, one of the places I get most annoyed with Victor, because as his father, he's checking with his dad, and his dad says, "Oh, yes, Justine, I think she's innocent too, but, she's going to have to be put on trial." And Victor knows and tries to tell him, "My dear father, you're mistaken. Justine is innocent." But he doesn't say anything. So now, not only does he have his brother's death hanging on his conscience, but he also has, if this woman is found to be guilty, she will also be put to death. And that's another guilt that he has to carry around, another burden. And if we take this back to Rime of the Ancient Mariner, another albatross that's going to be hung around his neck as evidence of his sins. So we leave the end of chapter 7 going into chapter 8, which we'll talk about, for our next little recording bit. So really the last thing that I would say here is there's tragedy all around in this chapter. Not only do we have the tragedy for Victor and losing his family members and his other family members, losing William, but it's tragic for Justine because she's going to be unfairly tried for this crime. It's tragic for Clerval having to leave behind his studies. It's also tragic for the monster though, because if he's the murderer, then we kind of have to ask why he is going around killing um, these people, or doing these terrible things to people that Victor cares about. Victor does tell us 2 years have passed since he reanimated this monster, where he never went to look for him. And so if the monster was smart enough to know where Victor's family is, residing in Geneva, what has he kind of been planning, and what has been his motivation for doing so? So we're going to find out a lot more about that in the next set of chapters. So hopefully this one helped. I think I have one more meme. What was it? Okay, kind of fitting with the end here, and this is where we'll end. Let's just say I'm Frankenstein's monster and I'm looking for my creators. So our next question is not going to be the characterization of Victor so much as the characterization of this monster. What is his motivation here, and what is he like? So hopefully this section wasn't too bad for you. Thanks for hanging in there with me, guys.